Marianne Katoppo, a storyteller theologian. In 1979, Marianne Katoppo, an Indonesian theologian, journalist, and novelist from Tomohon, published a theological book entitled Compassionate and Free. Katoppo was the first to explore Asian women's theological responses to the challenges they face in a patriarchal church and society, and her text even preceded the 1985 consultation of the Women's Commission of the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians. She was one of the leading voices of the so-called eruption within the eruption at the meetings of the Ecumenical Association for Third World Theologians in the late 70s, 80s, and even into the early 90s. In the 1970s, and through the 1980s, the emergence of a movement of theological voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America was frequently referred to as the eruption of the Third World. In the collected edition, called Eruption of the Third World, the editors, using a dialectical understanding, note that this eruption must be understood as an awakening wherein the oppressed, having become conscious of their dehumanization, seek to challenge the existing social order in order to struggle for a full humanity. Therefore, the eruption within the eruption refers to the movement within this of feminist theologians pointing to the exclusion of their voices and analyses. Katoppo, as aforementioned, is noted as having been one of the key voices demanding this inclusion. These demands eventually led to the establishment of a Women's Commission of Third World Theology, but more specifically also reinscribes the focus of this movement. For the eruptors within the eruption, and I quote, "Liberation thus takes on an existential meaning, but its goal is the liberation of all men and women from whatever binds them internally and externally. Liberation leads to wholeness." End quote. Katoppo's book paved the way for Asian women to think differently and articulate in a unique way their theological visions for a liberating and justice-filled church and society. As a writer, thinker, and theologian in her context and in her time, Katoppo was not only a fierce advocate and critic within her theological circles and in her church, but was also an outspoken critic of the then authoritarian New Order, Orde Baru, government in Indonesia. This is an important component of liberation theologians of the time, this dedication to building a just world for all and speaking truth to all forms of power. There are many different aspects of Katoppo's work that I would like to dwell on, but for the sake of brevity, I will only touch on two: storytelling and language. One of Katoppo's key strengths, arguably, as a theologian, is that she is, first and foremost, a storyteller. In fact, she published 5 full-length novels. Her theological work often contains key cases or stories that are potted throughout her writing. These stories serve as a way to illustrate her argument and are primarily a tactic she uses to lay bare the reality of the lived experiences of, in Katoppo's case, poverty in Asia, and the challenges working-class Asian women face. She explains her focus on giving the reader these stories in this way. I quote, "In doing Asian theology, we cannot limit ourselves to beautifully worded abstract concepts. Of course, well-fed bourgeois theologians have all the time in the world for that. But if one really encounters the powerless Christ in the oppressive structures of Asia, and indeed everywhere, it's very clear the time is running out. The face of the exploited non-person is the face of Christ." End quote. Katoppo, like other feminist theologians like Heather Walton, uses storytelling in a strategic way. That is, in the telling of these stories, there is a refusal of silencing and a development of a strategy of cultural resistance. The storytelling of experiences goes beyond just producing knowledge. There is a hope here to construct a creative space that challenges existing ideas and information, whilst also asking thinkers to write about an imaginative global otherwise, one which is made magical simply by acknowledging the emotional, relational, and indeed human encounters that make and unmake our worlds. Feminist writers assert the multidimensionality of textual and oral knowledge and engage with fiction to show us how it helps us move from identifying texts as containing absolutes, rather to see these as spaces of multiplicity. Feminist, anti-colonial, and especially faith-based thinkers are drawn to alternative worlds and are therefore attuned to different ways of seeing and being in these worlds. Far from the singularity of the world out there, these approaches are interested in relational and emotional life worlds, something we see particularly in Katoppo's novels and theology. Storytelling is also a fundamental form of theologizing in Asia. Asian theologies of liberation include the theology of the Minyang and of the Dalit, both rising out of sight struggle. It is a gathering of the stories of these struggles, and therefore it's kind of curious that there's little work looking at the relationship between literature, storytelling, and theology. So, for example, documents that for Minyang theology, storytelling is a form of revelation. Young Li furthers this discussion by explicitly saying that Minyang theology is best understood as a storytelling theology. For Li, the stories regarding the actual events of liberation form the contents of the theology. This is particularly due to the fact that many of those who identify as Minyang were not conventionally educated, and therefore it was through the telling of stories that they came to understand divine action in their lives. Minyang theology focuses on the stories told by the common people, the interpretation of these stories about God's actions in history. And to this end, Minyang theologians note that what is fundamental to Minyang theology is that the Minyang's experience of Han is told in stories and not through a systematic theology. Storytelling is a form through which the Minyang can accuse, challenge, and lament the injustice of society. And these stories are meant to raise the anti-establishment consciousness and therefore lead the receiver of these stories to revolution. As Park notes, and I quote, "Stories have the potential power of being able to explode the Minyang's collective Han and bring forth a revolution. Minyang language is storytelling," end quote. Similarly, Dalit theologians and writers are also keen to center the importance of storytelling. For example, Nayar's exploration of the importance of two Dalit novels points out how, in the case of the novel Sangati, it is the storytelling in the novel, as well as the effect of hearing the novel, that leads to the events of change. In a connected but slightly different form, Schmaltz's accounts of a North Indian Dalit Catholic mission recounts how, for this community, the stories that these Dalit Catholics relate are a way through which they are able to mark out the boundaries of the social and cultural field. The stories are a form of resistance in that they are a way of destabilizing the boundaries of identity, but also imagining otherwise, a different context for autonomy and agency. That is, they tell the story of what is to become. And so, storytelling becomes part of non-compliance and overt resistance. So we can say that storytelling is the resistance narrative. Phulan Kwok was also essentially guided by stories. Amongst her first essays is one titled, "God Weeps with Our Pain." She writes that her methodology for this essay was to gather women's stories as resources. And the very third paragraph of this story begins, "I would like to tell you a story that makes people cry." For Phulan, the storytelling format here is important to make feminist theology a plea and an invocation, and a reminder that some stories have no ending. In this way, the story becomes the tool through which to give the individual relating personal catharsis, but is also the way in which, arguably, the social revolution is mobilized. and so to language, which is of course intimately connected to storytelling. Katoppo spoke and wrote 9